name's Rory Martorana. I am a reference librarian here at the New Haven Free Public Library at the Ives branch, and I specialize in adult health and literacy initiatives. I'm joined this evening by Maya Dusenbery. Maya is a journalist and editor and the author of the book that we're discussing tonight, Doing Harm: The Truth About How Bad Medicine and Lazy Science Leave Women Dismissed, Misdiagnosed, and Sick. New York Times Editor's Choice pick, Doing Harm was the winner of the 2019 Minnesota Book Award for general nonfiction, and it was named one of the best books of the year in 2018 by NPR. Formerly the editorial director of the feminist blog, feministing.com, Maya has written for publications including the New York Times Magazine, Scientific American, Slate, Mother Jones, and Pacific Standard. She regularly speaks about gender bias in medicine to students, healthcare providers, patient advocates, and researchers. And thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm gonna hop right in on the questions. First of all, the actual topic of the book, what inspired you to write this? Because I know you don't have a background in medicine, but it seems to be a deep interest of yours as it is mine. So I was just wondering what your influences were.
Yeah, you're right. I wasn't super focused on medicine or health generally. For the first several years of my career, I was mostly writing about feminist issues. Before I became a journalist, I worked in reproductive health advocacy. So I was somewhat focused on women's health through the lens of reproductive rights. But it really wasn't until I was 27 and I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis that I sort of started down this path that led to this book project. So, up until that point, I'd been really healthy, a young person who felt pretty invincible. And so when I became sick, it was an eye-opening experience on a number of levels. I realized that I just hadn't given much thought to how well equipped the medical system was to care for me if I were actually seriously ill. And I also realized that as a feminist writer, I had been pretty blind to the ways that gender bias affects medicine beyond just reproductive health issues. So that was kind of the first impetus to kind of think more. And then also, I had my own personal experience getting diagnosed with RA was pretty straightforward and really relatively quick and easy. But I got really interested in learning about autoimmune diseases, which disproportionately affect women, and learning that so many other autoimmune patients really have a very different experience. They often face long diagnostic delays, and during that time often feel like doctors aren't taking their symptoms seriously, are sort of dismissing them as stress or anxiety. So the book was really at root a kind of attempt to understand why so many women had experiences like those.
Awesome. So considering that doctors are trained to understand the complexities of pain, why would they doubt their patients?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the most interesting kind of pieces of history that I explored in the book was sort of the way our understanding of pain has really progressed in the last few decades, from, really having a pretty simplistic model of what pain is as this very kind of straightforward relationship between noxious stimuli. So if you, touch a hot pan and it burns your hand, there's a very obvious signal that gets sent to your brain that that's hot and you should drop the pan. But when it comes to chronic pain, there's a much more complex kind of multi-directional relationship where, the extent of tissue damage or other kind of visible or measurable inflammation does not necessarily correlate with the patient's own reports of how much pain they're in. And so historically, that's created a lot of problems for patients who have chronic pain conditions. I would argue, especially if they're women, because the doctor really does have to rely on the patient's own self-report of what they're experiencing in their body to have an accurate understanding of how much pain they're in. And so, that's kind of when it comes to pain. But I think, one of the big takeaways from my research was that when it comes to really any symptom that's subjective, so that can't be sort of measured objectively by the doctor, it is really important that providers trust the patient's own self-reports. And for a lot of, historical reasons that I got into in the book, women are one group of patients who often have a really hard time being seen as sort of reliable reporters of that pain or other subjective symptoms.
So you talk about some different types of illnesses in the book, and each one is paired with a different real woman's individual story. I'm wondering how you selected these women, and if you interviewed them or they just submitted their stories. What did that process look like? And also, I was wondering if there's a particular individual who was included or even not included, whose experience struck you or kind of stuck with you more than others.
Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of the stories that I included in the book, I got by kind of putting forward a call for stories on Feministing, where I was an editor at the time. It was a pretty widely read feminist blog. And so I just put up a Google document where people could write a brief description of their experience. And from that, I got almost 200 stories, sort of brief stories, and then followed up with dozens of people to kind of hear more about their experience and do full interviews. I also found women to interview through some of the patient advocates that I interviewed for the book, as well as doctors. So I did, a little bit of finding particular stories to kind of illustrate particular points, but I did get a lot of really good stories from just that first call. And to me, I think one of the most powerful things was just kind of seeing the patterns among all of them. I think one of the real kind of one thing that I was really surprised by interviewing people was how much there was this tendency for women to kind of think that their story must be somehow like really unique, or the result of just having bad luck, or there was just one bad apple that they happened to have. And it made me realize how difficult it is for people interacting with the medical system to really know whether their own experience really is just kind of this individual thing, or whether it's part of these larger patterns and the consequence of these unconscious biases. And so in my interviews, a lot of women said, it really took kind of, once they started sharing their story more publicly, or even with friends, and kind of hearing from other women that something similar had happened to them, that was when there was this kind of moment of realization that, this isn't just me, this is part of this larger systemic problem. So I think all of the stories are really compelling. I think, one that was kind of the most dramatic was, she has an alias in the book, but Maggie, she was a college student who was suffering abdominal pain that eventually was diagnosed as an ulcer that had burst. So she had the actual hole. So it was a very life-threatening emergency, but for over the course of like 3 days, she was ending up in the ER, complaining of this really severe pain. She couldn't walk, she couldn't speak, but was initially, seen as just an anxious college student who was overreacting. Then was seen as a drug seeker when she came back again, and was kind of, met with that sort of suspicion. And finally, she was just kind of disbelieved entirely. And there was a very kind of dramatic moment where there was a clear switch that was flipped when the doctors finally, they were doing tests, but there wasn't anything objective coming back. And then they redid a scan and saw, there was this like very clear hole that shouldn't be there. And at that point, they knew that some organ in her body had ruptured, and she was rushed into exploratory surgery. And so I think that really showed kind of what I call the trust gap, that, when patients, before there's kind of objective evidence, patients' own voices can often be dismissed. And in that case, it was a real clear case of, a life and death difference between believing the patient and not believing her.
I'm glad you mentioned that trust gap. I wanted to ask a question about that. So you had mentioned in the book, you referred to them as the knowledge gap and the trust gap. And you describe these two concepts as mutually reinforcing to such a degree that they become stubbornly difficult to correct. So what is the difference between them, and how do they kind of play off or into one another?
Yeah, so the knowledge gap just kind of refers to the fact that we really still to this day don't have as much information as about women's bodies and symptoms and conditions that disproportionately affect women as we do for men. And that's really the legacy of a lot of things, many decades where women were really underrepresented or else outright excluded from a lot of clinical research for a number of reasons, including that there was concerns about fetal harm if they accidentally became pregnant during clinical trials. There was this thought that women's kind of confusing hormonal states and cycles made them more complicated research subjects, and it was seen as kind of just easier and cleaner and simpler to study men and extrapolate those results to women. And there's also just been a general tendency for conditions that primarily impact women to not be seen as particularly urgent or serious, and kind of to be neglected on the research agenda. So when it comes to conditions like endometriosis, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, conditions that primarily affect women have been really understudied. And so they're often poorly understood, unsurprisingly. So that's the knowledge gap. And then the trust gap is, what I've been talking about already, but this tendency to kind of dismiss or minimize or normalize women's symptoms, and especially to psychologize them. So, one of the big things I was interested in kind of understanding better when I started my research was why it was that so many women are told, it's just stress or anxiety, and kind of get some version of it's all in your head. And in the book, I kind of trace how that stereotype is the result of this long history of hysteria, which was, this kind of gendered diagnostic category for really millennia, that has been sort of used to explain away women's unexplained symptoms. And yeah, one of my biggest takeaways is that these two problems are really mutually reinforcing in the sense that as long as we don't know a lot about women's health and disease, it becomes easy for medicine to kind of reach to that stereotype that, women are just prone to psychosomatic conditions, to kind of explain away those gaps in knowledge. And then on the flip side, I think there hasn't been as much pressure as there should be to kind of close the knowledge gaps that still exist because of that kind of long-standing myth that women are just prone to be hysterical. And if that's the case, why should we devote research into studying unexplained conditions that mostly affect women?
I definitely want to talk more about the whole concept of hysteria. You go really deep into the history of it in the book. I know when I was telling friends that I was going to be doing this talk with you, I was kind of talking about the book, and it feels like, at least with like my female friends, all of them have an experience with this, like all of us. And so, and I thought, like there's been times that doctors like, just lose a couple pounds, or, maybe go home and have a cough drop and like call me later. But I just recently experienced it. My APRN who did my therapy and my med management retired. So I just met the woman who was going to do my meds, and I'm autistic, and that's not common in women, or studied in women. And like this isn't very professional, but she opened up by, so you're autistic. Says who? And it's, it's like the doctor that I spent months and thousands of dollars working with, who diagnosed me after many tests. So the hysteria thing, it seems women frequently, and this like branches out from medicine into other aspects of life, but a lot of common stereotypes that we're just nervous, or it's a psychosomatic thing, or what have you. You devote a large portion of the book to hysteria, and you even go into the etymology of the word. Could you talk a little bit more about the history and how it's played into that stereotype that women are just emotional and anxious, and we have overactive imaginations?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so hysteria has a pretty long, varied history, kind of dating back to ancient Greek medicine when a range of different ailments were attributed to a wandering womb that was roving about the body. So hysteria comes from the Greek word for uterus. And then over the decades or over the centuries, it kind of morphed. So then, by the 17th, 18th century, as medicine was starting to kind of understand the nervous system, hysteria was seen as a disorder of the nervous system. And so it was still seen though as something that was very, more common in women, was somehow connected to their reproductive organs. But the explanation was more that, it was about women's, sensitive nerves. But throughout that whole history, there was no question that hysteria was seen as an organic disease. It was a real physical disease. It was just very tied up in sort of ideas about women's kind of inherent sickness. But then after Freud came along and psychiatry became its own specialty within medicine, there was this kind of major shift where hysteria came to be seen not as a physical disease, but as a psychological disorder that caused physical symptoms. And so that was led to this situation where, doctors, when faced with a symptom that they couldn't explain medically, could kind of blame it on the patient's unconscious mind, and see it as psychosomatic. And women continued to be seen as the kind of typical hysterical patient with such kind of psychosomatic symptoms. And so this was, a really convenient notion, I think, for medicine, as it was sort of becoming more confident in its ability to kind of explain people's sickness. It had this diagnostic category where it could kind of throw everything that was not yet explained, that it couldn't explain, and just attribute it to the patient's mind. I think women, that kind of concept is definitely connected to our sort of more general gendered stereotypes about women being more emotional than men, having a more, emotional response to pain or other symptoms. But I do think it also has this even more kind of specific history within medicine, where, it's just kind of been taught as a fact that women are more prone to psychosomatic symptoms. Once hysteria underwent that final transformation, it fell out of favor as an actual, diagnosis, and different euphemisms kind of took its place. So now, terms like psychosomatic, somatoform disorders, for a while, Briquet syndrome was, so there are different terms that all generally mean the same thing, which is that the symptom is not attributable to a physiological disorder. I do think that it can be difficult for women when they're entering the medical system to kind of realize how much that history really is still at play, because I think it feels kind of removed. And I think especially a lot of the younger women that I interviewed for the book, generally have a sense that their authority is respected in various realms. And so it's kind of a shock to be encounter this kind of bias within medicine and realize that they were sort of being treated as these unreliable reporters, as overly emotional, and realize that they were kind of up against some sort of stereotype that it was not totally clear where it came from. And I think one of the really hard problems about this trust gap is that women can't really get out of it because if you play into this stereotype, if you kind of try to communicate how serious your pain is or how urgent your symptoms are by, being emotional, you are liable to be, dismissed as just hysterical. But if you try to do the opposite and be really ultra stoic, which a lot of women feel they need to do in order to be taken seriously, that is also risky because then doctors might just say, well, she's not crying or, showing her pain. And we expect that from women. Therefore, probably nothing's the matter.
So I did some researching on the topic after finishing your book. And since your book, so many others have come out on the same topic, even just within our library collection alone, and not just all the stuff that was published, but here at the library, we have over a dozen books that just talk about gender bias in medicine and particularly towards women. And I mean, I came across, I can't even count how many articles, podcasts, videos on YouTube about this. So it seems like there's plenty of awareness, and this is like a hundreds-year-old issue. Why do you think it continues to be a problem, and how do you think we could bridge the gap between awareness, which there's plenty of, and advocacy to change things?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is a kind of confusing thing because, when I started my research, which was several years ago now, there wasn't as much. Certainly there wasn't as many books. There was kind of one from the late 90s that I was like really excited to find, but I kind of had this sense that it was surprising how little public awareness there was, and especially like within feminist circles, that I was very much a part of, it felt like a pretty under theorized topic. And I think, my own sort of sense coming into the research was, like I knew that women had obviously been underrepresented, as practitioners of medicine for a long time, that there had been these like, kind of ancient, really sexist stereotypes about women's bodies. But yet I had this sense that, surely these problems must have been fixed by now. I even knew that in the 90s, there were congressional hearings about the fact that women were left out of clinical research. But at that point, I sort of thought, well, there was this kind of public reckoning at that point, and so surely we've fixed it by now. And so I think one of the big things I learned, kind of first and foremost, as I understood the medical system more, was just how long it takes for this system to change. That to some extent we're still kind of dealing with the legacy of that knowledge gap, just because it takes a really long time for new medical research to get, incorporated into medical education and to actually change clinical practice. In general, that is a long process. And, especially when you're kind of calling for reassessment and recognition of the fact that half the population has been sort of left out of medicine for quite a while. That just takes a long time. But you're right. I think, there's been a real a plethora of books and memoirs and just more kind of, even just on social media, people talking about this issue and naming it, as a problem, as, medical gaslighting, and so I do think there's certainly just in the last several years been a real change in awareness. And I think translating that into actual changes, I think requires a lot of sort of will on the part of people who are actually working within the system. So, I've been heartened to, be invited to talk to medical students, and I know that there are people thinking about how to kind of better educate doctors on these issues. But I think that we can't underestimate how much that kind of takes a concerted effort, that even if it feels like there's people talking on the internet or in books in the library, that we need that awareness to get to the people who are actually in positions of power to change things.
Just want to take a brief moment to invite anyone who's watching. If you have questions, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. Feel free to pop them in there. I have plenty of questions, but I will get to the audience ones as well. Those are very important. I wanted to ask you, so this is a problem that obviously heavily impacts women, and you mentioned this in your book, it also impacts people of color, of all genders, trans and non-binary people. Did you just decide to focus on women for the sake of time, or is there kind of a lack of research concerning other genders? I know that trans medicine really has only come into the spotlight more recently than when the book came out, so I was just curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, I just, obviously you can write a whole book. There have been great books on gender or on racial bias in medicine, and all of these intersecting biases that are really, have long histories within medicine themselves. We've touched on, weight bias is, I think, a huge one, and touch on a little bit in the book that intersects, I think, with gender bias a lot, where women especially are told, just every possible symptom under the sun can be blamed on your weight, and just lose weight and everything will be better. So I mean, I tried my best to sort of discuss how those other biases intersect with gender bias. But yeah, I really felt like I couldn't, do justice to all the ways that medicine fails marginalized people of all kinds in one book. But yeah, I hope that people, recognize that obviously so many patients fall into one of those categories, if not multiple categories, that have been historically, marginalized, and who, have encounter providers with a lot of unconscious biases, and that those things are obviously connected. That medicine is sort of has been this very white, male, cisgender profession for a long time, and that is one of the reasons why people who aren't like that have gotten subpar care for so long.
So we have a question from Patricia, who very patiently has been waiting since 6:34 for a response. So what's one takeaway that you would hope librarians would take that you think would be most helpful for people seeking health information?
I mean, I hope people seeking health information for themselves do read my book. I think I really hope that I think a lot of people who are seeking information because they're seeking seeking a diagnosis and having trouble navigating the system, I think it is really important that people in that position realize these kind of biases exist in medicine, and that they may not realize yet how much they're sort of being viewed through the lens of the hysterical woman, or the drug-seeking Black person, or the overweight patient who just needs to lose a few pounds. I mean, obviously people have those experiences, and I think can feel that, but I think I hope it's helpful to kind of have the historical context and the hard data to show that that really again, those experiences happen for a reason, and they're not just happening to you. And I hope that sort of knowledge can in itself be a little bit empowering and help patients to feel comfortable, pushing back or finding a second opinion and not just giving up. I think one of the biggest dangers for people who are, navigating the system and struggling with not being taken seriously is that it is so easy to internalize that dismissal, and eventually just kind of get worn down or kind of gaslit into thinking, oh, maybe I am just stressed, and so yeah, I hope that books like mine and these others that are kind of speaking to the more systemic problems can be helpful to individuals seeking health information, yeah, of all kinds.
So the book, at least at the beginning, explores some other barriers to access aside from just the medical bias. In the introduction, you wrote, it's worth spending some time considering obstacles that many women have to overcome to access the medical system at all. Can you talk about some of those obstacles and how they might set us up in a way for those stereotypes about women being hypochondriacs or hysterical?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, again, it kind of just in the service of, focusing on something that I could cover in just one book, I kind of set aside the fact that, of course, we still don't live in a country with universal health care. And, there are still real barriers to even seeing a doctor for a lot of people, if not only because they lack insurance, but if they don't have sick days to take off from work, if they can't get childcare to or transportation, all these things, in a country of great economic inequality mean that there are a lot of people who have really precarious access to the medical system to begin with. And I think that really kind of really kind of exacerbates a lot of the problems that I'm talking about, because if you're somebody who is in that position and you're dismissed by one doctor that you've taken the afternoon off to see, that might not be the kind of start of like a long diagnostic delay where you're seeing 30 doctors, which is not uncommon for some women. You might just that might just be the end of the line because you don't have the resources to get a second opinion, let alone a 30th. And so I think the consequence of that is that a lot of the most less privileged women who lack that access just are kind of invisible to the medical system entirely. They're not getting the accurate diagnoses, they're not getting treatment. And so one of the consequences of that, apart from, that is leaving a lot of sick and vulnerable people without care that they should be receiving, is that it sort of has played into the stereotype that a lot of poorly understood conditions that primarily affect women are sort of, just like white women's diseases, or they're like, these kind of frivolous things. So, we have stereotypes about, just a wide range of conditions that have affected women. Primarily, migraine was seen as like this, affliction of like type A women. Endometriosis was stereotyped as the career woman's disease for a really long time. Lyme disease is seen as chronic Lyme disease is seen as sort of an affliction of white suburban women who are kind of overly concerned with their health. And, I think that I would argue that all of that is just kind of a product of the systemic failure. So it's only the most privileged, well-resourced, often white women who have the ability to keep pushing and pushing and pushing to get a diagnosis and to get care in a lot of cases.
This relates to an audience question. Is there a country or countries that practice good and enlightened medicine? I think that your research primarily deals with the US, but did you come across any countries that do a better job than we do?
Yeah, it does primarily deal with the US, although I kind of pulled studies from other places too. And to some extent, I think a lot of these issues are pretty, widely shared across, at least in Western countries. You know, the knowledge gap, I think especially really affects, everybody. But I think, yeah, there are differences, obviously, in terms of, what we've just been talking about. People who live in countries with access to universal healthcare may have a different experience to some degree, and lots of different, cultural differences in how the profession is sort of perpetuated. But again, yeah, I didn't do a real kind of systematic cross-country comparison, so I don't feel like I can speak to the particulars. But I will say, I've been interviewed by media in New Zealand and Australia and Germany and the Netherlands, and so I think that a lot of these issues do seem to resonate in other countries as well.
So we're living in a time right now with new and resurgent illnesses that we haven't really thought of a lot, including like COVID and monkeypox. And I know early on, we actually did a program at the library for this, but it was well documented, at least early on, how COVID was disproportionately affecting men worse than women. In what ways do you think the pandemic has impacted medical care in regards to the biases and the medical gaslighting? Do you think it helped doctors be more open-minded to something new, or just makes it harder?
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, as you said, when the beginning of the pandemic, where there was, this early indication that there was this sort of gender difference in people's outcomes, I think that there was a sense of hope among some of the experts on sex and gender differences that I'd interviewed for the book, who, were saying, this is an opportunity to really highlight the fact that, like, this new emerging disease that the entire world is focused on, it does seem to be one that has this difference in how it plays out in men and women on average. And so that means that we should be aware of that, and we should be, designing studies to, that account for that as we, look at developing vaccines and developing treatments and tracking everything. And I think that there was some kind of awareness, but I don't think that there was, as much sort of, I don't think that happened as much as it should have. The other big thing is, as this pandemic was emerging, a lot of patients within the myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome community were saying, hey, this is probably going to be a virus, like many viruses, that causes long-term symptoms in a subset of patients, because we know that that is the case. And we need to, raise awareness about that. And indeed, that's what happened. Long COVID became a thing that we started to realize a few months in was happening to patients who, really basically encountered all of these biases within the medical system that many patients with complex, poorly understood conditions have been encountering for decades. They kind of encountered it in this kind of abbreviated timeline. And yeah, you point to this hope that, especially for a entirely new disease, medicine would approach that sort of unknown phenomenon with more openness to listening to patients and humility about the fact that we don't know. Maybe patients aren't going to get, all patients aren't going to get better after 2 weeks. And instead, I think we saw that a lot of doctors were very dismissive, and in that early wave, as patients were developing long COVID, many were told, you couldn't possibly still be sick because it's only a 2-week thing, or, you didn't have access to a test, so we're not going to believe that you even had COVID to begin with, even though nobody had access to tests at that point. And so, and of course, there's been lots of reporting on this now, but it really took, a really pretty incredible effort by patient activists to form, support groups on Facebook, on Slack, Body Politic, in, countries all over the world. Patients advocated to get medicine to recognize long COVID as a thing and recognize that we needed to be systematically studying it. And, I really don't think that would have happened without the patients organizing the way that they did, because I think that the system is sort of set up to dismiss patient voices, until there's that sort of objective evidence, and and to not have humility even in the face of an entirely new disease.
I was impressed by how well researched the book was. So I was wondering if you can speak for a moment on how research played a role in your writing process. And I'm also wondering what the most surprising thing was that you learned.
I think, I wrote the book in a pretty fast timeline. It was like less than 2 years. So it felt kind of like just a mad dash of researching and writing. And there wasn't much kind of like separation between the two. It was sort of like I was researching as I went, and ideally, I think would have loved to have more time to sort of go down kind of rabbit holes, and not feel such pressure to figure out, what was actually going to fit in the book, because obviously it is a really big topic. And but I loved the research, especially on sort of the history of medicine sections, like kind of tracing the history of different conditions. I think was just like really interesting to kind of dive into the medical literature on that, and to kind of think about how these conditions have been understood in different ways over time. So many things were surprising. I think one of the most surprising was just to realize how much that history of hysteria that we've talked about really is not that far in the past. Like, it isn't far in the past, but the sort of legacy of that is really, if you kind of trace the history, it's really clear how and why that still really impacts the way doctors are taught and the way women are treated in the medical system today. And so I think that was really a big surprise, just kind of coming into it knowing, a little bit about hysteria as a sort of historical concept. I don't think I would have expected to realize how much that was, not just historical, but really quite a modern phenomenon too.
So having done this research and written this book, what would your advice be to someone who's experienced these biases and medical gaslighting?
This is a really tough question that I get all the time, of course, but I think it's just really important to recognize that, these are such systemic problems that can't be sort of fixed by anything that one individual does. And so, I just want to preface it by saying, I think in order to fix the problem for everybody, we really need people within medicine to take responsibility for making the systemic changes that will really, close the knowledge gap, address the trust gap. Because I don't think the onus should be on individual patients to sort of become, super advocates for themselves in order to kind of compensate for those biases and those failures that are really the responsibility of medicine. That said, I do, obviously individuals are navigating this system that's imperfect. And I think it is really important to recognize that doctors are fallible human beings and that medicine is an incomplete science, and to kind of go in with that understanding that these, are experts who have, trained, but also they don't know everything, and to kind of have a healthy skepticism, especially if a doctor is telling you that there's nothing wrong, or you're overreacting when you know something is wrong in your body, to really trust yourself. And I think, I've kind of touched on this before, but I do think it is, it's really easy for even the most sort of well-educated and empowered women to start to doubt themselves when faced with a medical professional who's, given a lot of authority in our culture. If they're dismissing you and gaslighting you, it can be hard to kind of have that trust in your own instincts. So I think that, that would be the number one thing. And, often that means just getting another opinion and finding somebody who's going to listen to you.
So we're approaching the end of the hour. I just want to invite anyone who's watching who might have any questions or comments to share. Please feel free to get those in, and I will try to get you an answer. You talk in the book also about sexist paternalism. I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit how that contributes to the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think paternalism has kind of played a big role in various parts of this. When women were really left out of clinical research, one of the reasons given was that we don't want to expose women to the risks of being research subjects. And that was partly a sort of concern that, again, that they would become pregnant, and which, that's also kind of paternalistic too, that people weren't trusted to take steps to avoid pregnancy if they were in a trial, or to take, terminate it if they chose to. But also that we didn't want to, that there are, of course, risks to being part of clinical trials. And so we didn't want to expose women to those harms out of some sort of chivalrous, favor. And as opposed to recognizing that, yes, while there are definitely risks, there are also benefits to individuals and to, women at large to being included in research, so that we learn more about their conditions and how treatments affect them. So I think that is definitely a big way that paternalism has played out there.
We have a great question from Gina, who asks, are female physicians less biased? Which I know you talk about in the book. So.
Yeah, definitely. I think that I didn't find really great systematic research on this question, but it's one that I do get a lot. I think that there is some evidence that in some particular contexts, women doctors provide better care to female patients, but there's other research that shows no difference. Or there's also sort of more generally, it's kind of pretty well established that female doctors tend to be better doctors to all patients. They tend to be more patient-centered, to follow evidence-based guidelines better. And so, that's one reason to choose female doctors for everyone. But I think, my personal, and anecdotally, a lot of the women that I interviewed, I'd say it was split between some who said, I absolutely, had better care from women, and I choose female doctors because of that. And others who said, I received some of my most dismissive care from female doctors, and, were really disappointed by that. And I think my own view of the problem is that while I do hope that there's some difference, I think that these are really about systemic problems in medicine. Every doctor goes through, the same general curriculum, the same kind of skewed body of medical knowledge. And, even the kind of unconscious biases that are, play out in the stress gap and the stereotypes about women's emotionality, all of us are really affected by that. Whether we're men or women, or whether we're medical professionals or not, those are sort of stereotypes that are in the cultural ether. And so I don't think female doctors are necessarily immune, unfortunately.
Do you still follow this topic? And if so, what types of improvements have been made since the book was published, or have there not been?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I mean, I think, as you noted, I think that there's definitely a lot more awareness about this problem. I think that the effort that the long COVID patients have made to kind of raise awareness about post-viral chronic illnesses is something that I think feels really hopeful to me for, and specifically for patients who have conditions like myalgic encephalomyelitis and POTS, and these are, again, female predominant conditions. And so I think that that's one thing that makes me feel like there's a lot more hope now on that front than there was 3 years ago. On the other hand, I think in a post-COVID world, I think there's a lot of things that are big challenges in kind of making progress on these issues. The doctors are understandably very burnt out. There's, staff shortages in the medical system, and all of that, I think, just puts more pressure on the system. People who are burnt out are more likely to make biased decisions, like research shows that. And so I think that, one way to one area that I think we need to improve is kind of recognizing that we need to be kind of changing the culture of medicine so that people are equipped with what they need to do their jobs well, which, means, a less, a system that isn't so kind of overworked, and that really gives people the resources to provide the best care that they can.
Don't see any more questions from viewers, so I'm going to be mindful of the time and wrap it up. This discussion was made possible by gifts to the New Haven Free Public Library Foundation. And if you enjoyed tonight's event, please consider making a donation at nhfpl.org/donate, which I'll put in the chat. This helps support our collections, our programs, and our services throughout the year. A full list of our events are available on our website at nhfpl.org. And I just wanted to also ask if anyone who's watching could take a moment when you close Zoom tonight. A web browser will open with a brief feedback survey. I'm also going to put that in the chat just in case it doesn't work. Please take a moment to complete that survey. It only takes like 2 seconds, but we always read every single response, and we use that information to inform future programs and future offerings. And Maya, I just want to thank you again. It was such a great book. I hope that there's more coming from you. And thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Have a great night.
You too.